Bien, muy bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todas a nuestro seminario Filantropía en tiempos inciertos, una guía para la filantropía efectiva, que hemos organizado en conjunto el Centro de Filantropía e Inversiones Sociales de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez de Chile, con esta imagen que tengo a mi espalda con la montaña, en conjunto con el Stanford Center of Philanthropy and Civil Society, con el apoyo de Goldman Sachs y la Asociación de Empresas Familiares de Chile. Esta es una invitación que hemos hecho a distintos líderes de inversión social en la región, preocupados porque la pandemia ha tenido un enorme impacto en el bienestar de las comunidades. Aún no tenemos claridad de la profundidad ni tampoco del fin de esta pandemia, de sus efectos en tantas dimensiones, de salud, de empleo, de educación, entre otros ámbitos. Asimismo, hemos visto el valor del trabajo colaborativo que han impulsado muchas organizaciones, muchos líderes en temas de inversión social, con muchos actores del sector público, privado y de la sociedad civil, y donde hemos visto, sobre todo en esta pandemia, en esta crisis, cómo la sociedad civil tiene un rol fundamental que cumplir. Son tiempos inciertos y complejos donde creemos que la filantropía tiene aún más valor, no solo para proveer ayudas inmediatas, sino para lograr poner el foco en esos cambios de fondo, a la raíz de los problemas que requieren soluciones de largo plazo. Una pregunta recurrente que escuchamos en quienes lideran iniciativas de inversión social es: ¿estoy logrando el mayor impacto posible? En el CEFIS UAI promovemos los principios de la filantropía efectiva, y en este camino hemos encontrado muchos y buenos socios, gente e instituciones de amplia trayectoria promoviendo los principios de generar valor a través de la inversión social privada, entregando herramientas a quienes lideran iniciativas de este tipo en la región. Eso es lo que nos preocupa. Uno de estos socios fundamentales es Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, una institución líder, no solo en Estados Unidos, sino que a nivel global en el sector. Por ello, queríamos compartir con ustedes y con gran entusiasmo esta nueva alianza que estamos inaugurando hoy entre el CEFIS UAI y Stanford PACS para promover la filantropía efectiva en la región. Y estamos iniciando este trabajo conjunto para desarrollar una guía de filantropía efectiva que reúna el conocimiento desarrollado en Stanford, pero adaptado a la cultura y el quehacer de América Latina. Al final de este encuentro comentaremos los detalles y los próximos pasos que queremos compartir con ustedes, pero aquí también tenemos a dos socios fundamentales: la Asociación de Empresas Familiares AEF de Chile, que promueve con mucha fuerza la filantropía familiar efectiva en el mundo de las familias empresarias, y Goldman Sachs, que también ha permanecido comprometido con la inversión social sostenible. Para introducir el panel, voy a pasar ahora el inglés. Tenemos un botón ahí en Zoom, encontrarán su botón de interpretación, está habilitado para aquellos que quieran seguir escuchando la traducción que tenemos disponible para que ustedes puedan seguir la traducción al castellano, puedan continuar el resto del seminario con traducción, también pueden seguir con la traducción, o sea, con el idioma original que vamos a pasar al inglés. We have really a great panel today that will enlighten us on the role of philanthropy in these uncertain times we're living, and especially how effective philanthropy can help us enhance positive impact. To start, we will hear an introduction from Paul Brest, former Dean and Professor Emeritus at Stanford Law School and Faculty Co-Director of the Center of Philanthropy and Civil Society and Co-Director of Stanford Law and Policy Lab. He was President of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation from 2000 to 2012. And he is co-author of the book Money Well Spent, A Strategic Guide to Smart Philanthropy, which I really recommend. Afterwards, Paul will involve in the conversation our panelists today: Rodrigo Villar, Senior Researcher at CEFIS UAI, that has more than 30 years of experience in private social investments in the region, author on different publications on philanthropy in Latin America, legal framework for philanthropy, community philanthropy, and institutional philanthropy. George Anastasiou will be also part of this panel. He's the president of the Association of Family Enterprise from AEF, from Chile, and president of one of the leading family foundations in Chile, Fundación Mustakis. Felipe Medina will be also part of this panel. He's member of the Advisory Committee for Private Philanthropy at Goldman Sachs and member of the Advisory Committee at Stanford PACS. And he's a man of long trajectory in promoting philanthropy in Latin America. And we'll have Erin Andrews, Director of Philanthropy Research and Education at Stanford Center of Philanthropy and Civil Society, and she leads the Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiative. At the end, Erin and I will share with you our partnership and the project we're today starting to develop to donors in the region, the Guide for Effective Philanthropy in Latin America. So Paul, let me thank you all for joining us today, and especially for our panelists for your participation. Please, Paul, go ahead.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. And I'm going to tell you everything I know about effective philanthropy in 7 minutes or less. So there are fundamentally 4 tenets of effective philanthropy, and these apply to organizations as well. And later on, I'll differentiate philanthropists from the organizations they support. The first is to have clear goals, outcomes, what success would mean like, what success would mean. The second is to have a strategy, sometimes called a theory of change, based on the best evidence available. The third is to monitor the implementation of the strategy, to make course corrections where things don't go exactly as you intended. And in philanthropy, as in navigating a ship, things usually do go off course and need to be corrected. And fourth, evaluation, asking whether your strategy actually made a difference, whether it actually had impact. Especially with respect to the first two, with respect to goals and with respect to strategies, it's really important to listen to your grantees, and important for the philanthropist and their grantees to listen to the beneficiaries of their work. Very often, it is the beneficiaries who know what really is going to help them rather than somebody sitting in an office some distance away. So back to goals. Goals precede strategy. There are, my guess is among the people assembled here today, you have many, many different goals or objectives in your philanthropy. There are various theories of what good goals should be, but ultimately that's your decision or the decision for an organization that you're considering funding. And the core tenet, a kind of starting place for effective philanthropy, is clear about what goals you're pursuing. You know, in Alice in Wonderland, there's a dialogue between Alice and the Cheshire Cat, and Alice asks for directions, and the Cheshire Cat says, "Where are you going?" And Alice says, "I don't know." And the Cheshire Cat says, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." And that's a danger that philanthropists should avoid. So what about strategy? The theories of change. There are many possible different approaches, but let me talk about kind of 2 buckets of different approaches. One is service delivery. This is what looks most conventionally like charity. It has very little risk because an organization delivering the services has done it again and again. A very good example is providing malaria bed nets in Africa and other malaria-prone places, where there have been very good evaluations to show that if bed nets are provided and people are instructed how to use them well, it will reduce the incidence of malaria. At the other end are risky strategies, strategies involving systems change or advocacy. Many of those have a low probability of success, but they're worth doing if you think that the benefit from them is going to be huge. Advocacy, which I was involved in at the Hewlett Foundation to try to prevent climate change, is an example. Another nice example, Carrie Tuna, who is the director of the Open Philanthropy Project, did funding in order to prevent the likelihood of a pandemic and to deal with it. And obviously, in this particular case, it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work, though, was because risky strategies very often don't. But without that kind of funding, there would be very little chance of dealing with pandemics. So the criteria for deciding what your approach is going to be is what's going to be most effective. And it also has to take into account the philanthropist's risk tolerance. The philanthropist has to have your own goals, right? Nobody but you as a funder can set goals. But the philanthropists may also have their own strategies, but they also may rely on the organizations they fund to have strategies. And in this case, part of the due diligence process is asking whether the organization's strategies make sense to you, whether they seem sound and based on evidence. And finally, a note about grant making itself. Again, to simplify, there are two basic forms of grant making. One, which is ideal when it can be done, is general operating support, unrestricted support to the organization. This gives the organization the alignment, the autonomy that it needs in order to work successfully. And this is the best strategy when your goals as a philanthropist are well aligned with the goals and activities of the organization. Alternatively, you might give support for particular projects. That's when there may not be an overall alignment of the organization and your goals, but there are particular things that the organization does, particular activities that you wish to support. A really important thing to keep in mind when you are providing project support is to be sure to provide adequate overhead or indirect costs. One of the most subversive things that philanthropy can do is provide project support and not provide the necessary indirect costs that every organization incurs. Effectiveness is not just achieving your short-term goals, it's ensuring the vitality of the organizations. There's a motto, I think, that at least the US Boy Scouts had, which is to leave the campground in as good shape as you found it. And that applies to philanthropy as well. And then finally, is there a difference in a time of pandemic, in a time of crisis, in these uncertain times? The basic tenets are no different. The issues you may deal with are different. The time horizons may be different, but the fundamental tenets of effective philanthropy are exactly the same in times of crisis as they are in ordinary times. And let me stop there, having spent 7 minutes on this. And let me first turn to Rodrigo. As the regional expert and author on philanthropy, having lived and worked extensively in Colombia, Mexico, and Chile, what are some of the challenges you're seeing in philanthropy in the region? What areas are ripe for innovation or improvement?
Well, it's a great honor to be with you, Erin, George, and Felipe in this panel. And thank you for your wonderful presentation and your question. In short, my answer is this. For the challenges that we have in Latin America, we need a philanthropy that is bold and humble at the same time. Bold in its ambition, impact-driven, innovative, less risk-averse, and with a systemic change approach. Some of your tenants that you mentioned. Humble in the sense that you listen more to those it wants to serve and open to work with others that have more knowledge of the issues they want to address. But let me explain my answer better. Latin America is facing many complex and interrelated challenges, and the pandemic has further magnified them. In terms of poverty, Latin America is losing 15 years of progress. The pandemic has moved 22 million into poverty and 8 million more into extreme poverty. These are not just numbers. It's millions of families who can only afford one meal a day. In education, an important field of philanthropy, the pandemic is increasing inequality and leaving millions of children behind. School closure have affected more the poor, rural, and disadvantaged areas, and has taken a heavier toll on girls. The UN General Secretary has called the impact of COVID a generational catastrophe. UNESCO estimates that in Latin America, at least 3 million students are not going to return to the school after the pandemic. That means more young people with no hope in the future. And this has happened in a context where public distrust in institutions has grown exponentially. The Latinobarometer survey showed that the people consider public institutions are not delivering the public goods they expect. And the satisfaction with the performance of democracy is just 24%, a big drop from the 44% 15 years ago. 78% of the population in the region don't trust government. 79% don't trust Congress. 87% don't trust political parties. Now, no matter the size of philanthropy, it will never have the resources or capabilities to replace government and public institutions in the role of providing public goods. But if philanthropy is bold, it can test new ideas, develop institutions, and advocate for reforms of public policy and public institutions. Philanthropy cannot solve alone the systemic problems, but philanthropy can be part of the solution. Being part means working and collaborate with others and having a collective impact mindset. This is the humble element of my proposition. But let me close my reflection with one example. As a quick response for the urgent needs during the pandemic, 12 foundations in Chile decide to work together and create a collective fund, el Fondo de Respuesta Comunitaria, the Community Response Fund. In the process of co-designing it, they realized that there were many other actors who knew better the territories they want to reach. They invited NGOs with long experience in the field to form regional committees where decisions could be made over different aspects of the program. This means establishing dialogue, collaboration, and sharing the power with NGOs. The whole purpose of the fund was not to bring the solution to the people in need, but to recognize and support the different solutions that community philanthropy and grassroots organizations were bringing to their communities. The government recognized the value of this model and replicate it as a way to scaling up. This is an example of philanthropy that is bold and humble at the same time. And more examples like this, I think we need in Latin America.
Thank you. That's very powerful set of remarks. Felipe, you're situated squarely between the United States and Latin America, living in Florida, but traveling frequently to Latin America. You work for the US-based global firm Goldman Sachs. What would you add to what Rodrigo just shared? And what do you see as the role of private investors in philanthropy?
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would like to first emphasize something that Paul and Rodrigo both mentioned, but I think is probably one of the most critical points to understand. People that are successful in business sometimes think that they can translate that success to the social sector, but they don't realize that the social sector is very complex. So I think one of the first lessons is, as both Paul and Rodrigo mentioned, having the humility to listen and focus on co-creating and co-constructing instead of having a predetermined view of what people need. I think that is a critical component to take home from this meeting. Secondly, and structurally, Latin America philanthropy historically has not been very keen in endowments. It's been more of a component as pay as you go. And the issue with this structure is that when you have difficult situations, philanthropy is typically one of the first items that is cut, and exactly the time that you really need more philanthropy. So one of the things that we would like to encourage some of the participants is to really think about creating a permanent endowment that would assure that the philanthropy donations would stay over time. One last thing that I think it's an important change to take into account, and Paul had a little bit of a reference of this, but I would like to expand on this, is the relationship between donors and grantees. And it's an asymmetric asymmetric power relationship between both of these groups, because the folks that have the money have all the power. And many times the organizations that are using the money don't have the incentives to share mistakes. So you really have to create an environment where you serve more of a coach or a mentor, and you encourage organizations to share those mistakes, so that not only that organization, but other organizations in the same sector can learn the mistakes, and you help to build up the ecosystem. And my last comment has to do with how we allocate resources. Specifically, how do we develop philanthropic budgets? I always enjoy asking individuals and families in Latin America, how do you formalize your philanthropic budget? And most of them look at me with a strange face and they say, well, we see what we gave that last year and we do something similar, or we see what opportunities come up, but they don't really have a methodology to develop their philanthropic budget. And there's a lot of very generous individuals and families that might donate $1 million or several $1 million, but they don't realize that that amount as a percent of the net worth today is very different than what it was about 10 or 15 years ago. So my suggestion is, when you look at your philanthropic budget, think about it in relative terms and not in absolute terms. And you will find out that if you cannot find a specific methodology, we could go back to the biblical days and consider giving 10% of your net income as the minimum donation that you will give in a given year. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And finally, George, you're a significant promoter of family philanthropy in Latin America. What role do you think that family philanthropy can or should play in dealing with the current crisis? And how could family businesses get more involved in enhancing philanthropy in the region?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Magdalena and Erin, for making this seminar possible. I'm quite agree. First, I go into your question, Paul. I quite agree of what Felipe said. I think this is a very special moment when you see which is the real equilibrium between those that are in the field and those that have the power, and how do you deal with it in a very human way. And going into your question, Paul, I agree that effective philanthropy is not a big difference if you are in a crisis than if you're not. Normally, philanthropy has been acting in crisis, and most of the support it's towards an equilibrium in between what society it's proposing and having as reality. So what we have really see in this crisis is maybe a quicker approach to effectiveness, and this could be set in few ways of acting, to hear and to really look the reality with a different perspective. And this perspective of the crisis moves from an idea we can have of what's happening in the country, and then what happens in a very short term with the economy of each community that it's weak enough. It's very difficult to support, and what we've seen as foundations in Chile is that even if we are involved in education, in learning, in smart learning, in ways to go, not only in presential but also online, and then you have to move towards what's online, because there's no way of having a different approach. So this stresses the position, and I guess it's very important to understand it with very quickly and to act very quickly. Then I guess you have to look for those programs that really will approach communities and get directly to the beneficiaries as soon as possible. Because if you're late, then there's no effectiveness. In another way, I appreciate what happened here with this crisis response fund that we did put together with different foundations from the IF and CEFIS was very near of what we were doing, and this had the beneficiary of putting together different strands, not only approaching to the people in reality and let them decide what they wanted to do with the funds, but also the approach was one approach. Everybody was helping with their own strengths, and this worked really very quick, very effectively, and that it's something that it's a good example of what can happen in a crisis. The action to be collectively and to get quickly with a lovely perspective to the final beneficiaries. I think it's another way of understanding the way we can improve the approach. And then the coaching or the company we have to do with very weak organizations that are in the base of our communities. I think was one of the learning we had this last year. How we can improve and simplify the way to measure the effects of what has been done and what has been done to share it with the communities. I think it's another important issue that foundations have been understanding, not to look for very complex ways to measure, but to be there at a very first moment and to deliver different ways and instruments of simple ways of measurement. And I guess about that, it's what I see in the sense of what philanthropy and family philanthropy has approached to the crisis, and I expect this is something we learned and we understand that it's a way to do it in a normal situation. I guess this has been a good exercise for our future commitment with communities. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Well, the three of you have raised issues that could keep us going the rest of the day, but let me, in the 10 or 15 minutes we have, let me begin with the point that we began with, that Rodrigo began with, which is there philanthropy has, there are really two forms of collaboration he discussed. I'd like to talk about each one separately. One is collaboration with government. And the assumption that philanthropy, at least in the United States, is made, and I'd like to hear how to what extent it's true in your countries, in Latin American countries, is that government is pretty competent, and philanthropy can support, it can strengthen it, and it can supplement and sometimes complement government activities. What happens when government is incompetent? I just finished reading a very powerful book by Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball and The Big Short. This is a new book called The Premonition, and it describes in very sad terms the incompetence of CDC and of state governments in dealing with some basic issues during the pandemic. What happens when government is not competent, and what role can philanthropy play? And I hope that all of you will feel free to comment on that.
I can jump in this. I agree. The idea is not always to collaborate with the government, but many times to reform government and to try that work well. Then it's many examples in Latin America. You can see now in Mexico, I live there, and it's really difficult to work with government. But if it's difficult, one of the challenge for philanthropy is how to change it, how to change public policy, how to change public institutions. But my point that I want to talk about is we need good governance for the needs and the challenge that we have. It's impossible to think all these challenges in poverty, climate change, unemployment, many things, if you don't have the government in your side. It's difficult to work with government. Many times you cannot collaborate, you need to change, but we need to have the government in our equation.
Felipe and George, do you have comments on that?
Thank you. I guess it's a very important issue that philanthropy really approaches governmental social help in the different ways philanthropy has. It's sometimes is a much nearer relation with communities. Some other times it's more specialized. Most of the times it's more opportunistic, and in that sense, of course, philanthropic actions have not the need to go through so many filters as governmental beneficiaries. So I guess it's a different way to approach a different scale. We need to work on that, and we need to understand the different strengths of and weakness of a governmental approach. And in this specific year where we've been in this response to communities, government was there. Government was a little bit late, but government was hearing and approaching what we could do as non-profit organizations very quickly, and I think it's a learning. It's a good learning of what has to be done, and which is the participation of each one of us. I guess the problem was not who does the best, but how we can work together, and understanding different strengths and weakness of each public or private interaction.
Thank you. Felipe, do you want to say a word about this? And then I have another question
Yeah,
for the group.
I mean, I think the role of philanthropy in government and promoting democracy as a whole, it's a complex one, especially in Latin America, where institutions are not as strong, and as Rodrigo was mentioning at the beginning, trust on institutions is so low. But if you're taking a systems approach, you definitely have to involve government. If the government is inept, then the philanthropy should have a role in helping change that component. But it is a slippery slope, because there's been some dark forces of philanthropy or so-called philanthropy in Latin America that have worked against governments, and that is something to be careful with as well.
Thank you. So let me quickly go to a question of collaboration among philanthropies, whether they're family foundations or other foundations or high net worth individual philanthropists. What do you see as the barriers to collaboration in Latin America?
I would say there's two main barriers. One is trust, where sometimes people think that somebody's doing a philanthropy endeavor just to fulfill their goals and not to help society at large. And the second is egos, or what we call in Spanish protagonismo, where folks are interested in promoting their image, but not necessarily in sharing best practices.
George and Rodrigo, do you have thoughts about that?
I'm sure that trust is the most common, or untrust is the most common problem between public and private enterprises. And philanthropy is not a way of that, because philanthropy today in Latin America is mostly related to families that are related to business or companies. So normally that's a huge barrier to go over, and sometimes the other big issue is to understand that foundations that have endowment have a much quicker response and can also do some piloting of different issues that governmental response it's not possible. So not only that, also the period in which you the philanthropic way to act, it's getting trust in between their own organization. Philanthropy has a long-term view, a long-term strategy, a long-term organization. Governments change each 4 years, not only in the presidential layer, but also all the layers down. So sometimes really they don't know what they're doing. They don't know the groups, the teams. So this is a big issue in terms of what private and philanthropy can increase the way of looking a long-term, a medium-term problem. With it's another strategy, it's another way of approaching.
Thank you. Rodrigo, do you want to add to this?
Yes, I want to. I know that the trust is an important barrier, but I want to respond with a positive view that the infrastructure in philanthropy is really a good way to develop the learning process, the trust among the philanthropists. The AF process, they convene many philanthropists in Chile the AFE in Colombia, the GIFE in Chile, the CEMEFI in Mexico, and the Red America, a network of 80 foundations in Latin America. They are putting together philanthropists to learn together, to put together, to do many things together. There is, I understand that the trust is a problem, but there are many ways to overcome this important barrier.
Great. It's nice to end on an optimistic note about what's possible. I think it's important to think about barriers as a way, and I'm sure you would agree, Rodrigo, think about barriers as a way to then figure out how to overcome them and have the positive vision. Well, thanks to all three of you for a terrific conversation. And I now turn to Aaron. Aaron and I and our colleagues spent a lot of time developing the Guide to Effective Philanthropy, which, by the way, I would recommend more highly than my own book, because it's easier to read and it's free. Aaron, can you tell the audience a bit more about why we developed the Guide to Effective Philanthropy, what's included in the book, how donors can use it, and how you think it can be adapted to be relevant for an audience in Latin America?
Thank you, Paul. And thank you to all the panelists as well. I just found a lot of what you had to say really relevant with what we're seeing in the United States as well. And there has just been an increasing hunger and interest in collaborative kinds of efforts where you know, the nonprofits and beneficiaries are more involved than ever before in the philanthropy process. So thank you for those thoughts and comments. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Guide to Effective Philanthropy, as Paul said. So we spent a number of years developing this, and the reason why we developed this resource was we really wanted to create a guide for emerging donors. So we would see from research and just general behavior around donors that donors would, over the course of their lifetime, give more and more dollars. They would give to their alma mater, they would give to their kids' school, they might give to their religious institution or their friends' causes. And over time, they would realize that, oh my goodness, I just gave away $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, and I didn't really think about it. And so when donors are at that inflection point, that transition from being reactive to thinking, gosh, I really want to be thoughtful about my philanthropy, this book is exactly the right book for that type of person who is really at that inflection point transitioning. So what's included in the resource? Let me share a few slides with you so you can see what we have so far, and that will give you a sense of what we'll be developing with CEFIS as we go over these next few months. So this is what the resource looks like, and this is a link. We can share it in the chat as well to the free digital resource. You can also purchase a print copy through our website. So the guide is developed into two parts. This first part is the first 6 chapters, and it talks about developing your plan. So that really aligns with what Paul was saying around identifying clear goals and developing a strategy, and so much more. So you can see here some of the content we include is how to find your focus, that is articulating what your goal is, figuring out what your budget is, figuring out how you want to spend your time and your money on what you're trying to achieve through your philanthropy. Of course, involving one's family is very important for many donors, and so we talk about that as well, and different ways that donors can engage their family members in this process. And then you can also see here, this speaks to what a number of the panelists were talking about. Philanthropy doesn't have to be a solo endeavor. There are great ways to learn from others in the field or find opportunities to connect with others who can help you develop your plan even further. The guide is filled with charts and tables and takeaways and tips. So it's really meant to be an easy to read resource. You can see this is an example of how you might allocate your budget and time, as well as some takeaways at the end of a chapter, just as an example of what the content looks like. The next 3 chapters in this first part talk about giving vehicles. So how a donor would choose between credit card, check. In the United States, we have a donor advised fund as an option, et cetera. And then chapters 5 and 6 really get to the heart of strategy that Paul was talking about. So how do nonprofits solve problems? And then how do they develop a theory of change based on what they're trying to achieve? And donors can actually do this for their own philanthropy as well. And it's not just a useful tool for due diligence. This shows an example of the different approaches that philanthropists or nonprofits might take, such as direct service, research, policy, systems change. And you can see we also include donor stories from donors who have taken different approaches. And then part 2 is about actually implementing your plan. So this includes another 6 chapters. Here are a few. How to find effective organizations that you can then conduct due diligence on, and then figure out the best way to engage in a relationship with that organization to fund them as well. So that's what these chapters cover. And here you can see if you were to perform your own landscape analysis to really understand what organizations are out there working in the areas that are important to you, these are some questions you might ask to learn more. This shows the beginning of the due diligence chapter, where you can see the types of topics you would want to think about as you vet the organizations you're considering funding. So those are just some examples. And then the last 3 chapters focus on the actual best practices around making gifts. So how you would structure those dollars. It talks about the unrestricted general operating support that Paul talks about how to exit a relationship or a funding opportunity, as well as we look at in these last 2 chapters, funding with others. So collaborative opportunities, ways to pool funding to amplify the impact of your dollars. And then also the very popular topic, socially motivated investing. So what are some ways to align your dollars in that way as well for impact investing opportunities or ESG funds. And this just shows a few of the ways that you might collaborate with other donors, learning with them, following what a foundation funds, collaborating, coordinating funding with others, and more. So I'm going to stop my screen share there. That I just wanted to give you a sense of what's in the guide so that you can see what's to come. We really want donors to be using this resource, popping in and out of chapters, meeting them where they are. It's filled with information about what's important, definitions, frameworks, and then activities at the end of each chapter to drive the donor toward action, to develop their plan. Now, what's really exciting about this partnership is how we plan to create an adapted resource. So I think Magdalena, in her introductory remarks, mentioned this is not just going to be a word-for-word translation. We're really going to work with her team and a team of experts to develop a cultural adaptation that's going to take into account the nuances and the specific considerations for philanthropists in Latin America. We've already started this process, and some of the topics that we've been looking at and digging into that really would be interesting to update regarding the Latin American version would be, looking at the ways that the different legal structures for that are going to vary country by country. So we have donor advised funds, and that's going to vary in a different way across Latin America. Some other differences are, donors might want to be involved. It's going to vary regionally in how they have what sort of collaborative opportunities, what resources, what groups are out there that can support donors in this region. We also are going to be looking at the involvement of family. It's family is very important to individuals in this region, maybe more so than what we see in the United States in some cases. And so we'll need to explore that more fully. And we also, the guide is filled with stories from US donors, and we want to be sure to update that with donors regionally who are doing this kind of work. Of course, there is a lot of overlap, things that are universally applicable, having a donor find their focus, how nonprofits solve problems, different strategies for finding organizations, the appropriate ways to interact with a nonprofit. So there will be a lot of content that is consistent with what you will be thinking about in Latin America. And then we'll be working with Magdalena and her team to figure out the best way to update the content and make it relevant to this audience. So I suspect Magdalena will share maybe some more details about the partnership or process. But just to say, we're very excited to be collaborating with CEFIS and the thoughtful sponsors of this work. And we really hope that this new publication will allow funders in Latin America to learn from the successes and also the mistakes that we have had and apply those practices in your local environments. So thank you very much and look forward to continuing to engage with you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Erin, and thank you for all the panelists. And I think we will be facing some of these differences and challenges that we have for these uncertain times, but as well, the difference from what you've learned in the US and that we have in Latin America. There are two interesting questions in our Q&A chat. One from Carmen Pachas that asked from Peru that Latin American countries have seen, different countries, how international aid funds have gone away from a lot of our countries. So looking at the future of post-pandemic, do you think that the funds will come back, and what will be the role with cooperations from family foundations or family philanthropy? That is a very interesting question. And I add the question from Gracia Goya from Mexico, a friend from Hispanics in Philanthropy, to Felipe. And I think it's interesting for the panel to see about the creation of endowments. The distribution of wealth is a key element or a key issue in Latin America, and the pandemic has shown that we have to have unconventional strategies. And what is the opinion on the announcement of Mackenzie Scott to give away a big part of his endowment? That is the type of question that we are really want to look at. What do really not just applies to Latin America, but to the future of the philanthropy in Latin America. I would, before I end in the 2 minutes we have, I don't know, Erin, George, Rodrigo, Paul, Felipe, our last 10 seconds thoughts on these questions and on the future of Latin America. George.
Thank you for the questions. I guess understanding endowment, it's a very important issue for foundations, for the long-term view, for their strategies, for the way they deal with the public enterprises and communities. My proposal is that most foundations that are created can be endowed from time to time. As they grow, they can open new endowments. Different family members can get involved, and of course, not only in the operation and the why and where and how, but also understanding that this is a way to promote the legacy of the family, the legacy of the foundation. If not, you are very weak, and in this special years we have had the pandemic, this is very clear. There's so many foundations that have a fantastic purpose, but there's no operational financial. So I guess understanding the benefits of endowment in philanthropy.
Who else wants to jump in and
I
other
will
questions as well? Rodrigo,
Okay.
the final thoughts. We're on time, but
No, I want to add something. It's for the future in Latin America. I think we need more family philanthropy. If you compare United States and Latin America, in United States, only 5% is corporate giving. In Chile, is 84% of the total giving. Latin America is the only region in the world where corporate foundation is prevalent. And for this, and for the future, we need more family foundation, individual philanthropy. We need that this grow. The only country with where family foundations are prevalent is Chile. They are corporate foundation, and we need this for the future.
great.
Magdalena, I'll just share a very quick dream, which is in 2040, when we look at what happened in Latin America, we'll see that Latin America learned of all the mistakes and all the best practices of the US and leapfrog the US in best practices of the social sector.
I share that dream also, and with the Stanford team here will help us. Paul, maybe a last thought?
My last thought is just the hope. This was a very exciting panel and very, very exciting to learn what's going on in Latin America. And Erin and I just share the hope that the guide, when it's translated and adapted to different Latin American countries, will really be of assistance to family foundations and others who want to be effective. So thank you for your work on this, and thanks for hosting the panel.
Well, thank you all. As the panel mentioned, we are just starting this work together, and it is very important, the adaptation to the Latin America. We will work with an expert committee, people from the region with a wide trajectory in philanthropy that will help us make sure that the content is really useful for social leaders. Agustín Landa from Mexico, Carolina Gomez from Colombia, Paula Fabiani from Brazil, Gabriel Berger from Argentina, Magdalena Diaz from Chile, Vicente León from Peru, Carolina Suarez, which has a wide and Latin American perspective. And on the other hand, we plan to interview and collect stories, peer learning from philanthropists in the region to share. So if you want to have any questions, want to participate, please reach us out at CEFIS. And I want to thank you, all participants, all of you that were part of this webinar, that attended this webinar, this thoughtful reflection. And thank you especially for the Erin and Paul from Stanford for this partnership that we're starting, and George and Felipe for the support and participation in this journey that we're starting to build up. So thank you all, and let's stay connected that we're starting this journey. All the best greetings to all of you. Muchas gracias. Bye-bye.
Thank you.